Welcome back. Joining us from Sydney is John Lyons, the ABC's head of investigative and in-depth journalism, a former foreign correspondent in Washington, New York and Jerusalem, a three-time Walkley Award winner and author of his recent memoir, Balcony Over Jerusalem. Thank you so much for coming on the show. That's quite a career. What made you want to be a journalist and a foreign correspondent?
In a way, one of the things that drove me to be a journalist first off was the desire to travel, basically. I was choosing between, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I got into Melbourne University to do some law, but then my career, one of the teachers at school, literally on my last day in Melbourne, just said to me, why don't you think about being a journalist? So I wrote letters off for cadetships, and 37 years later, I've had the most extraordinary career, and I absolutely love being a journalist, and I've been able to live in amazing places like the Middle East for 6 years with my family.
How did you end up based in Jerusalem, and what was that transition like for you and your family?
Well, I'd been to Jerusalem with my wife about 20 years ago, and we were quite enchanted by the city. It's a remarkable city. I think it's perhaps the most interesting city in the world because of its history, because of its different religions, its different cultures, and yes, the different tensions and conflicts that feed into it every day. Plus the wider Middle East. I'm fascinated by the Sunni and Shia battle. Iran, I went to more than once. I went to Iraq, I went to Lebanon. I mean, for a journalist, it's the most extraordinary place. So I wanted to go there. Once we'd visited and been quite enchanted by it, my aim was to go back there one day as a correspondent. So my wife and I and our son, who was then 8, went off to Jerusalem and had the most extraordinary 6-year adventure.
I'm sure. Were there any stories or places that you covered that particularly stuck with you?
I think I saw the rise and the fall of the Arab Spring. I saw the optimism of the Arab world, hoping for democracy. I saw the enthusiasm of crowds in places like Tahrir Square in Cairo. I was there when families were coming out. I saw people in Iran coming out and women putting their scarves back as a sign of revolt. And I saw, obviously the Islamic world, not just the Arab world.
Yeah.
And then I saw the brutal crushing of that rise and fall. That, I think, was really quite distressing to see so many people crushed so violently. And I lived on a daily basis in Jerusalem with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so in my book, I look at what life's actually like living in the suburbs of Jerusalem, living among Israelis and Palestinians, and seeing how they actually get on in the backyard level when someone has a barbecue and someone in the next yard doesn't like that. I saw the Israeli-Palestinian conflict really close up. And by the way, any comments I make today are not on behalf, in terms of the ABC. It's very much my time as a foreign correspondent.
Yeah. So what kind of challenges come with working as a journalist in the Middle East?
Well, the main one, of course, is security.
Yeah.
You have to really have your wits about you. It's simple things like, which driver you might get in with. You have to be making those judgments all the time. It is a very dangerous place. It's become much more dangerous. Journalists are now actively targeted. When I went there, journalists were seen as, it's great to have you here. You can bear witness to our story. As the years went on, they were actively targeted, and obviously journalists are taken hostage. The other big challenge for a journalist in the Middle East is actually establishing what the truth is, because you can be told one thing, and one thing you think is a fact, and 2 or 3 different sides, the Sunni and the Shia, will disagree that it's a fact, or the Israelis and Palestinians will say, no, that's untrue. So your challenge is to check and double check. So with my book, I tended to use sources that were only really unchallenged, that were impeccable and checked many times.
Yeah, and what inspired you to write a memoir about that part of your career?
I wanted to share my experiences, but, for a journalist, of course, being able to write 100,000 words rather than, on the average day I'd write 600 or 1,000. To be able to write 100,000 is like a kid in a lolly shop, and you can actually, what I've tried to do is take people on a journey. We arrive as a family in Jerusalem. getting my son into his new school. So I look at it through the prism, and in a way I wanted it to be a record of our time. It forced me, it took more, over 6 years to sort of get it all together. But it's this record for my son, for future generations if they're interested, as to these remarkable 6 years we had as a family. And as I say, it was an historic time. We saw the rise and the fall of the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
Historians will study that. Whereas I was lucky enough to be there in Tahrir Square, seeing all of this firsthand. And I think if you don't write some of these things down, then over the years you forget them.
Yeah. In saying that, are there any experiences that you had on the ground that you wish people who don't get to see the Middle East wish that they could see? Yes.
There are. The main thing I would like, it's hard to communicate to people, but when you're travelling the Middle East, and as an Australian and as a journalist, I was able to go from one side to another. I was able to go from Israel to Iran, which most people can't go to both. I was able to go with the Israeli army side, the Palestinian side. I was able to go into Lebanon and spend time talking to Hezbollah about what they want to do in terms of Israel. So I had this unique perspective. And what I realised in places like Iran is that the young people in Iran are just the same as the young people in Australia. They crave freedom. And so the image of Iran is, hordes of people in black chanting death to America. You do get some of them in Iran, but the majority of Iranians are like anybody. They want a normal, safe, secure life. Young people want to travel, enjoy music, go to concerts, and as they get older, they perhaps want to have families. And so I would talk to Israelis, for example, young Israelis, and they would tell me what they thought Iran was like. And then I'd talk to young Iranians in Tehran, and they would say, listen, we've really got no problem with Israel. It's just the situation with the Palestinians that's a problem. And you often felt if only these people could be in the same room together, if only these 19-year-olds could sit together somewhere, they would realise actually they're not that different. Peace wouldn't be that hard to get, as long as the people, rather than the governments, rather than the old men of Tehran, for example, were controlling the countries.
Yeah, you've had such an incredible career. Do you ever miss being a foreign correspondent in the Middle East?
Look, it's good to be home for a while, but I do miss the Middle East because, it's such a huge story for a journalist. It's so interesting. There's so many interesting people. You wake up one day and the newspaper will sort of say to me, can you go off to Baghdad or can you go off to Beirut? I mean, how many jobs can you have that are like that? I got this amazing phone call once from my editor at The Australian who said, listen, the Islamic State fighters are about 50 kilometres from Baghdad. That's half an hour's drive. Can you get there as soon as possible? And, so I'm on a plane flying into Baghdad. No one else is wanting to get in there because the most, bloodthirsty terrorist group of our time is within sort of taking control of the place. And as I was coming into land at Baghdad International Airport, I was sort of thinking, so what do I actually do? If they do take over Baghdad, what's my exit plan? And, you don't have any as a journalist. And so, the adrenaline of that sort of story, that sort of thing, of going, whether it's to Egypt or Jordan or Gaza or Turkey, Libya, I saw Colonel Gaddafi's dead body lying on the floor with a bullet in his head, and then you see all the Libyans, trying to get in to see him to prove he's dead and taking selfies with him. That's sort of, it's so raw, the Middle East. It's so unpredictable and so raw that, I'm afraid as great as Sydney and Australia is, it obviously doesn't have that level of conflict, fortunately.
Yeah, that's amazing. I wish we weren't, but we're running out of time and are going to have to go to a break. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experiences.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Balcony Over Jerusalem is currently available online and in bookstores. When we get back, we'll share some tips from travellers about the best things to see, do and eat in the United Arab Emirates.